Hi there, I'm April Callis-Birchmeier. I'm a certified change management professional, master change management professional, and project management professional. And today I wanted to talk a little bit with you about how do we talk about change when change is hard. This is a really difficult conversation in some cases because change is not easy. Sometimes change is inconvenient, sometimes change is frustrating, but sometimes it's just really difficult to accept that what we are used to and what we know and what we enjoy and are comfortable with is suddenly going to be different. And that's hard. That's really tough. And I don't mean like, oh, we do hard things. I mean, it hurts in your heart, it hurts in your stomach, and it's difficult to know what to do and how to communicate about change when it's hard. So let's talk a little bit about this because I think sometimes I find myself talking a lot about tools or methodologies or how to move a group of stakeholders forward to help them adopt change, but really this is more about just that loss piece of change. Every time that we have some sort of a change, there's loss. We can't we can't keep the old and adopt the new without losing something. And so that's why it's so difficult. And that's why change can feel so hard. And when I reflect on like changes that I've been through personally that were very, very hard, I think the number one uh, thing that made that change so hard was that sense of the unknown. Now, some people love that sense of the unknown. In fact, I recall, I remember when I was young, and my mom said to me one time, wow, your future is completely unknown. And that's really exciting. I wish my future were unknown. And I kind of wondered, oh, what does that mean exactly? And now that I'm older, I understand that. There's that sense of, gosh, you're not really sure what's going to happen. And while that can feel extremely terrifying and sort of intimidating because it's so comfortable to know, it's also exciting and somewhat invigorating, I'd have to say, to not know, to not be sure yet of what's going to happen next or what will be. So that is the thing that I think can make change feel extremely hard. That sense of the unknown, this sense of loss that we have when we have to change from something that's very comfortable, that is known and familiar, to something entirely different and uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And I think another piece that can really help us when change is hard is to figure out a way to talk about change when it's hard. Now, you might be aware that I talk a lot about the relevant, relatable story of change and how important it is to tell a story about the change that stakeholders can relate to, that they find that is relevant to what they're doing, and that is a story that kind of connects to them emotionally rather than trying to use like a lot of buzzwords and a lot of jargon that we think makes us sound smart, but usually is quite distancing. When we're able to come up with a relevant and relatable story, something that makes sense to people and relates to what they're going through, it can make it simpler to talk about the change. I know that when my children were young, I would try to talk about change in simpler terms, things that made sense to them. And they probably think I still try to talk that way. But I find that when we can lean on a story, when we have an analogy or an example to share, particularly something that's happened to us that's personal and interesting to others, um, we can make a big difference in talking about the feelings that change produces and the which is one of the big reasons that change is hard. You know, that loss, that sense of loss creates a lot of emotional um, entanglements for us. We feel emotionally bereft. We feel emotionally alone and kind of isolated, maybe in the wilderness, like nobody else is suffering this as much as we are. And that is, I think, a common sensation and feeling, that sense of loss with any type of change. And yet, when we are using our communication tools like stories about change, ensuring that timelines are clear, that questions are answered, it can make a tremendous difference to people who are suffering with that sense of emotional turmoil and not being sure how to talk about change. I also feel like it's difficult sometimes to know what to say when we don't have the answers. Nobody really loves it when we say, well, that's a great question, and I will try to find the answer to that. But that's sometimes all we have. We don't always have the answer. And sometimes the answer may never be found. I think it's important to recognize the question and to honor that question, and to also say that we don't have an answer yet. And I hope to find something to provide to you. I also think it's important to recognize that we don't want to shove people away emotionally by saying, well, we'll get to that later. We'll talk about that later. I think we should share if we're not sure or we don't know. I know some leaders feel like it makes them seem weak if they don't know an answer or they can't tell everything about a change. But I don't think that any of us really believe that uh, we we. I don't think any of us believe that everybody should always have all the answers. I do feel like one of the key pieces for leaders to focus on, however, before moving forward with a change is doing a thorough analysis, really defining that change. What is this change and how is it going to benefit our organization? And then developing that rationale. What's the reason for doing this change? What's the opportunity that we have right now? What's the risk that exists here? And the reason I think the developing the rationale is so important is many times we have opportunities that are time limited, right? There, I think John Cotter was one of those who talked about don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so, if we know we have an opportunity because there's a crisis, because there's a requirement that we need to meet, because there's a financial situation we have to address, if there is something happening in the world that opens the opportunity for us to make a change that will benefit the organization, I think that we have to really pursue that and talk about that. It's not fair to know what that opportunity and risk is and not share that in a relevant, relatable way with our stakeholders who are going through the change. And, there are times then when you can say, I don't know exactly what the future state's going to look like, but I do know it won't be where we are now. And that's important to really address because when we can be honest and we can tell people there will be change and we can say that the future state is still a little foggy in terms of the vision, but we have the opportunity. We are moving forward. We've defined this change and now we're going to start pursuing this change. I think that that goes a long way, particularly when we phrase it in ways that are relevant, relatable, and meaningful to our stakeholders. So sometimes we're in a situation where um, it feels like people aren't listening to us. What do you do when you have that situation? I think there's a number of different things that can happen. One is to really kind of look inward, right? Am I clearly communicating about the change itself, the rationale for that change, and the vision of what the future state is going to look like after we pursue this change, after we implement this change? I think if we are clear and we're sharing those in relevant, relatable terms, we're in a good place. I think also questions to think about are, if it feels like people are not listening, I think we have to look at what else is being shared in the organization. I mean, we may feel that we're sharing an opportunity that's a big piece, but there may be so much noise in the organization due to other changes that we don't have anyone's attention. And in that case, we have to kind of step back and look across the organization. Is the change we're working on aligned with the strategic goals of the organization? If it is, then we're going to have to really start to figure out how can we get that strategic vision across so that all the other projects sort of line up together, and we can reinforce this message. Um, I think change is really hard when we have so much going on, when there's so many changes, so much noise in the organization because every department or organizational unit has chosen to try to push their change forward kind of all at the same time. And that sometimes when that happens, what I'll do is I'll create like a stakeholder map where I put my stakeholder group at the center of the universe, and then I draw all of the impacts of different changes, different regulations, different ideas, messaging that are hitting that stakeholder group. And when things are rolling out and being implemented, to look at kind of what they're dealing with in terms of change saturation. I think if I don't have the ability to communicate widely in the organization, it's really important to pursue some sort of change agent network where I can talk to the change agents on a regular basis and ask them to take that message forward out into their units to ensure that people are hearing the change that's coming, that they're aware of what's happening. Because one of the things that makes change extremely hard is when there's a sense of not knowing in the organizational units. They feel like somebody's making decisions and moving things forward, and nobody has told them. So if I feel like I don't have that wide base of communication, like my communication tools are somewhat limited, I don't have access to every single area for communication, I will build a change agent network to help me disseminate information, and that relevant, relatable story across the organization and across many organizations. When I worked on a large statewide initiative that was really critically important that we share this information, I was really worried because I didn't know how we would ever get this information shared out. But I did not have to worry because when it really came time to make sure that everybody had what they needed, our communications governance group reached out to all of these nonprofit and other agency groups and shared information with them. And they all took that and moved forward with sharing it with their stakeholders, which was tremendously effective. And so there, you have to have a lot of coordination and planning to make that hard work happen. But when change is hard because you don't have that great communication path or excellent communication tools at hand, really leveraging and leaning into that change agent network and disseminating information through the network out to everyone is important. One of the things that I really spend a lot of time on when I'm working on a change is my communication plan. I want to first have a great understanding of all the tools available. And what I discovered when I was working on the statewide project was I didn't even have any, at first, I didn't have any inkling of how many communication tools were available. And as I started to work with the nonprofits and the other agencies that were sort of ancillary to ours, I found that some of these groups had webinars every week, and some of these groups had newsletters, and some of these groups had even they still seem to have like a listserv that they were using to communicate. A lot of groups have Slack to share very important messaging. And so I think that that was a great understanding for me that every that when I'm doing a communication inventory and I'm identifying all of the communication tools that I have at my disposal for this change effort, that I'm not only thinking about those things that are easy to see, but I'm also thinking about those tools that different groups have access to and how to leverage those tools as well. I think also focusing on key messaging and knowing our key messages so that we're rotating through the key messages and being very consistent with the communication that needs to be shared. That's an important um, piece of our communication plan, and it needs to um, really be vetted by the sponsor and the leadership so that they can also share those key messages. I think also focusing on how we're delivering, how we're developing and delivering communication is very important. One of the tools of developing communication and then ensuring that the communication is thoroughly reviewed, thoroughly approved, and then that the person who is the best to send that information is, in fact, the sender of the information. I think all of that requires a great deal of logistics and planning. And that's a real project management task that has to happen. Because when we're talking about change, when it's really hard, the more organized we can be and the more structured we can be with our delivery of communication, with our review of communication, with our development of the communication, the better. The better we will be because we have all these eyes and all these ears and all these opinions about how the communication is written, how it will be received by the different stakeholder groups, and how we're going to go about getting that work completed. So, I also like to take time during my communication plan to really take the entire plan down to an action item level. And then I want to calendar all of those action item events. So every single day, there is some form of communication on my calendar. And that is being developed in the pipeline weeks ahead of the time that it's going to be released. And so it's kind of a working backward to build that calendar of what to work on when, what to have approved, what to have vetted by the communication governance group and all of the leadership, and then how to get that delivered at the target date that we want that delivered. So there's so many pieces in the communication plan. And the communication plan is one of the component plans of the change management plan. Sometimes I feel like people think that the change management plan and the communication plan are the same thing, and they're not. Because the change management plan has the resource plan, which are the financial and physical information and human resources that we need to get something completed. Um, we have the communication plan, we have the sponsorship plan. How are we going to work with our sponsor? A stakeholder engagement plan. What will we be doing to engage with the stakeholders and to build that feedback loop for stakeholders? And then we have our readiness plan. We also have our benefit measurement and benefit realization plan, and then our sponsor or our sustainability plan, learning and development plan, so that we make sure that we're teaching the skills and competencies people need, and then finally that sustainability plan. So if you'd like to know how to craft a communication plan, how to talk about change when it's hard, some ways to really affirm, address, and assist people with the emotional journey that they have for a change effort. Please join me for our Ready, Set, Change accelerated training and exam prep this summer. We have a cohort that begins on June 1st. I'd love to have you in our group. We spend so much time talking about the Ready framework, how to help people adopt change more easily, and we also focus on writing the application, essays, and preparing for and studying for the CCMP exam so that you can become a certified change management professional through taking the exam and passing it and showing the world that you have what it takes, the experience, the expertise, and the knowledge to be able to lead change effectively. Talking about change when it's hard is a skill, and skills can be built. And I look forward to helping you build this skill where we can address something that is hard, difficult, and yet very meaningful to help people move from that current state to the future state where we know the benefit of the change exists. So that's it for the moment. Hope to see you in my cohort on June 1st. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about joining the Ready, Set, Change, accelerated training, and exam prep. I'd love to have you in our group. Love to see you and celebrate you as a CCMP. Until next time.